They found the boy in a field of frostbitten corn, eyes wide open, heart barely beating, no footprints around him but his own. He had been missing for 7 years. He hadn't aged a day. That's how it begins, before the doctors, before the clergy, before the lies. His name was Timothy Caldwell, and what he became was something the 19th century had no language for. A child born into a broken world but reshaped by something far more ancient than any asylum could contain. You've never heard this story because it was never meant to survive. It was buried quietly, behind leather-bound ledgers, sealed death certificates, and the kind of whispers men only allow themselves in the last hour of a sleepless night. But here's what no one told you. Timothy wasn't missing for 7 years. He was being prepared, transformed. The Missouri State Hospital claimed he escaped in 1878 during a routine fever outbreak, but the only fever that gripped that town was the one that doctors refused to write down. The records list him as mentally defective, animal harm tendencies, obsessive gaze, dissociative spells. But if you look closer, you'll find something buried under the medical jargon. He spoke languages no one taught him, drew machines that wouldn't be invented for another 40 years, and he never blinked when someone died. Not once. Then he vanished. And when he came back with a name that wasn't his. Thomas Whitfield. A polished smile, a knowledge of anatomy that should have taken decades to master, and a trail of corpses dressed up as natural deaths, every one of them elderly, every one of them vulnerable, and every one of them taken with surgical elegance. The kind of death you wouldn't notice until it was your father, your sister, your commanding officer. This isn't a story about a serial killer. This is a story about what happens when human systems, medicine, religion, science try to suppress something they cannot explain. When power protects itself, not the people. When a boy becomes a vessel for something we buried before the first cathedral was ever built. You're not watching a mystery, you're watching the return of something older than morality. And we're only just beginning. Now listen closely. What I tell you next doesn't leave this room. They called him a caregiver, but he was something closer to a mirror held up to the quiet desperation of dying families who only wanted one thing: comfort, closure, mercy. And Thomas Whitfield gave it to them. He moved through eastern Kansas like fog, silent, polite, impossible to hold on to. His patients were always near the end. War veterans haunted by what we now call PTSD, elderly widows with failing hearts, children who didn't speak anymore. And each one slipped away under his watch peacefully, painlessly, perfectly. Too perfectly. The thing is, real death is messy. No one dies like that, clean quiet, on Quen, lest someone intervenes. But when the county physicians began to ask questions, what they found wasn't criminal negligence or malpractice. It was precision, surgical accuracy. Thomas asked the right questions, filed the right paperwork, showed up at funerals, spoke like a man raised on scripture and science. But Dr. Samuel Harding knew better. He'd seen Timothy Caldwell in 1876, back when he was still just a boy who couldn't stop dissecting things that breathed. Harding had written about him in a journal no one was ever supposed to read. The boy does not blink. The boy does not sweat. The boy knows what I do not. When the deaths in Kansas began, Harding, old, retired, broken, felt it in his bones. This wasn't mercy. It was design, because here's the truth. Timothy had learned something in those 7 years, something not taught by any doctor or priest. He had learned how to end a life in a way that passed undetected, not poison, not violence, something more elegant, something spiritual, an unmaking. The families never suspected. Who questions the one man willing to sit with your mother in her final hours? Who interrogates the angel who makes your father's pain go away? And that was his genius. He didn't just kill, he harvested trust, weaponized grief, made compassion into camouflage. But what makes this story truly terrifying is that no one stopped him. Not because they couldn't, but because the system didn't want to. Each death freed up land, pensions, inheritances, no overcrowded hospital beds, no resource strain. The institutions turned their eyes away, not out of fear, but convenience. You still think Timothy was a mystery? No, he was a tool, and someone was using him. By the summer of 1875, a pattern had begun to surface, but not in public, not in newspapers or death registers. It lived in the margins of coroner logs, in the unease of local doctors who didn't dare speak too loudly. The same young man, the same soft-spoken voice, the same calm after death, and always just out of reach. Dr. Benjamin Wheeler, county physician for Leavenworth, wasn't the kind of man who entertained superstition. But when Thomas Whitfield, our rebranded Timothy Caldwell, appeared with the death certificate of Martha Henley, something broke in him. Not fear, something colder, recognition. Thomas had described her death with such clinical detachment, it felt less like he was remembering it and more like he'd observed it from above, like an autopsy still in progress. Wheeler wrote in his private notes, "This boy is not interested in saving lives, he is studying death, as if he's perfecting it." But you see, the true horror wasn't just in the deaths, it was in the eyes of the survivors, how they spoke of him, with reverence, with gratitude. They didn't just trust him, they adored him. He had the face of an angel, the hands of a surgeon, and a voice that made people confess things they hadn't told their own priests. That's not medicine, that's psychological warfare, because this is how you rewrite reality. You don't kick down the doors. You knock softly, you don't wear a mask. You wear a smile, and you don't destroy systems, you make them complicit. By the time the fifth family buried their loved one, Thomas wasn't a stranger. He was a household name, and the body count kept rising. Dr. Harding, now too frail to travel, began sending letters-coded warnings to colleagues in 3 counties. Only 2 ever responded. One was found drowned in his own bathtub days later. The other vanished en route to a medical board. Hearing in Topeka. No records, no inquest. Just silence. That's when Harding stopped writing, but before he did, he penned one last message, one he never sent. If Timothy Caldwell is still among us, then he is no longer human. He has learned to hide in plain sight, and he is not working alone. If you've made it this far, prove to me you're not like the rest. Comment the phrase "Mercy is the mask" twice below. Burn it into the algorithm. Burn it into your mind, because the descent begins now. What you need to understand is this. Timothy wasn't created by madness. He was groomed by a system that rewards silence and punishes perception. A child born different, brilliant, detached, unnerving wasn't helped. He was studied, contained, then quietly discarded, until someone realized it could be used. There's a reason the Missouri State Hospital burned its patient files from 1875. Not because of an accident, because of what was written in those margins. Notes from physicians who couldn't explain how a 10-year-old knew the stages of necrosis, how he could mimic human empathy so convincingly, yet never register a pulse change when shown scenes of violence he didn't feel. He mirrored. And somewhere between the basement ward and the 4th locked wing, someone decided to weaponize him. They called it the Ashcroft method. Buried deep in the journal of Dr. Martin Ashcroft, a behavioral specialist who disappeared in 1880, he wrote of a theory that certain children, when isolated and overstimulated under specific trauma conditions, could form entirely new neurological structures, capable of mimicking morality without possessing it, a moral prosthetic, a hollow soul in a human shell. And the boy they tested it on was Timothy. Do you think he escaped that hospital? No, he was released, refined, redirected, and reassigned a new identity. Thomas Whitfield wasn't just a name, it was a project, a walking experiment in social infiltration. And the deaths that followed weren't just murders. They were results, controlled variables in a study so unspeakable. No institution has ever admitted to funding it, but someone did. You want to know why the deaths were so precise, why no one caught him? Because it was never about getting away with it. It was about proving that with the right grooming, a single human could bypass every natural defense in the human psyche: trust, sympathy, even love, and deliver death with surgical efficiency, while being thanked for it. Timothy wasn't rogue, he was a prototype, and if that doesn't disturb you, then listen closely. Where one prototype exists, a program usually follows, and that means Timothy Caldwell may have just been the first. The next one might already be working in a hospice, or a nursing home, or across from you at dinner. Don't ask yourself if it's happening again. Ask why no one's willing to say it out loud. In August of 1875, Thomas Whitfield entered the home of Colonel Everett Langston, a war hero turned recluse whose body was failing as quickly as his memory. Langston had fought in Antietam, seen men gutted in the mud, and lived long enough to regret every breath afterward. He didn't fear death, he feared dying alone. Thomas told the family he could help for 3 weeks. He read to Langston from scripture and from science, switching seamlessly between verses and anatomical diagrams. He administered morphine, he prayed at the bedside. He recorded the colonel's final words in a little black notebook he never let anyone else touch. And when Langston died, the family wept not for the loss but for the beauty of his passing.